My family erased my existence for 5 full years. We had not spoken a single word since the night they threw me out of their home and told me I was a disgrace. So when they marched into my upscale restaurant on my busiest night, slammed a contract down on a reserved table and demanded 20% of my business, or else they would have me evicted by Monday morning, I should have been terrified. Instead, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. They thought they had me completely cornered. They had absolutely no idea who they were actually threatening. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile in the face of toxic family members who severely underestimated your power. Friday nights at Aura were always a beautiful kind of chaos. My restaurant sat right in the heart of Atlanta, a beacon of upscale Afro-fusion cuisine that took the rich, deep history of Southern Black cooking and elevated it to fine dining. The kitchen was my sanctuary. It was a symphony of hissing grills, clinking silverware, and the rich, intoxicating aroma of smoked paprika, thyme, and reduction sauces. I was standing at the expo station, completely in my zone. I was carefully plating my signature dish, a slow braised oxtail over truffle yam puree, wiping the edge of the pristine white plate with a clean cloth. I was proud of this dish. I was proud of this entire building. I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into every square inch of this place. I was just handing the plate off to a runner when Malik stepped up beside me. Malik was my chef de cuisine, but he was also my right hand, my protector, and the closest thing I had to real family these days. He leaned in close so the rest of the line cooks would not hear him. He told me there was a situation at the front desk. He said 4 people had just pushed right past the hostess and were refusing to leave. He looked worried, which was rare for Malik. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a deep breath, and pushed through the swinging double doors into the main dining room. The lighting in Aura was deliberately moody, casting a warm amber glow over the velvet booths and polished mahogany tables. The low hum of sophisticated conversation and clinking wine glasses filled the air. But as I walked toward the front entrance, all the warmth in the room seemed to evaporate. I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing right past the hostess stand, demanding attention from my staff, were the 4 people I had not seen in exactly 5 years. There was my father, Reginald, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that screamed of his obsession with wealth and status. Beside him stood my mother, Valerie, clutching a designer handbag, her face arranged in that familiar expression of perpetual judgment she usually reserved for the women at her elite mega-church. Next to her was my younger sister, Chloe, the family golden child, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car. And hovering behind Chloe with a look of supreme condescension was her husband, Connor. Connor was white loud and supposedly came from massive generational wealth. My family treated him like royalty. They did not say hello when I approached. They did not ask how I had been. There was no awkward hug or tentative smile. They just stared at me with cold, calculating eyes, as if I were a servant who had kept them waiting. The audacity of their silence was suffocating. 5 years of absolute erasure, 5 years of pretending they only had one daughter, and they walked into my establishment like they owned the ground I stood on. I squared my shoulders, ignoring the sudden pounding of my heart, and walked right up to them. I kept my face completely devoid of emotion. I am Kiara, the executive chef and owner of this establishment, and I was not about to let them see me sweat. Reginald did not even wait for me to speak. He bypassed all pleasantries, marched right past me, and dropped a thick manila folder onto one of my reserved VIP tables. The heavy thud of the folder hitting the wood made a few nearby diners turn their heads. Reginald pitched his voice loud enough to disrupt the quiet ambiance of my dining room. He announced that he knew my little soul food joint was drowning in debt. He let the words hang in the air, designed to humiliate me in front of my staff and my patrons. My little soul food joint. Aura was currently booked out 3 months in advance, but to Reginald, my life's work would never be anything more than a kitchen maid's hobby. I stood there in my chef coat, looking from the folder to my father's smug face. He crossed his arms and demanded that I sign over 20% of my equity to Connor immediately. He stated that Connor needed a new business venture to manage, and that bringing a real businessman on board was the only thing that could save me from total bankruptcy. The sheer, unmitigated gall of the demand echoed in my mind. I looked over at Connor. He was leaning against the mahogany trim, smirking at me like he was doing me a massive favor. Connor chimed in, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. He told me I had done a cute job setting the place up, but that the restaurant business was for professionals. He said he was willing to step in and fix my messy accounting so I could just focus on cooking. I felt Malik step up behind me. I could feel the heat radiating off him. Malik knew exactly what these people had put me through, and I knew he was 1 second away from calling security to throw them out onto the Atlanta pavement. I put a hand back to stop him. I did not want a scene. I wanted to hear exactly how far their delusion went. I looked at my mother, Valerie. She was examining her manicure, refusing to make eye contact with me, acting as if extorting her estranged daughter in the middle of a Friday night dinner service was just standard family business. Chloe was busy checking her reflection in the mirrored wall, looking completely bored by my existence. I turned my attention back to Reginald and asked him what would happen if I simply threw the folder in the trash and asked them to leave. Reginald stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me, just like he did when I was a teenager. That was when he dropped his ultimate threat. He leaned in and whispered loudly that he played golf every Sunday with the managing partner of the commercial real estate firm that owned this building. He smiled a ruthless, terrifying smile. He told me that if I did not sign that contract by Monday morning, he would make one phone call to his golf buddy. He promised me he would have my lease pulled, my doors padlocked, and my little restaurant completely shut down. He said I would be back on the street with nothing exactly where I belonged. Connor let out a short, arrogant laugh. He told me I should be grateful for the bailout. He said family looks out for family, even the ones who make bad choices. I stood there surrounded by the incredible restaurant I had built from absolute scratch. I looked at the manila folder sitting on the table. I looked at the father who threw me away, the mother who enabled him, the sister who mocked me, and the brother-in-law who thought he was my savior. 5 years ago I would have cried. 5 years ago I would have yelled, caused a massive scene, and begged them to love me. I would have let them see how badly their cruelty broke my heart. But the Kiara standing in front of them now was forged in fire. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I just stared at the folder. I had to clench my jaw so hard my teeth ached just to stop a massive, triumphant smile from spreading across my face. They thought they had done their research. They thought they held my entire livelihood in the palm of their hands. They thought Reginald's golf buddy had the power to destroy me. What they did not know was that Reginald's golf buddy had not owned this building for 2 years. What they did not know was that I owned the building. I owned the entire commercial block. I slowly reached out and picked up the manila folder. I tapped it against the table, feigning defeat. I looked at Reginald and told him I needed the weekend to have my lawyer look over the paperwork. I made my voice sound small and uncertain, playing perfectly into the narrative they had constructed in their heads. Reginald looked incredibly pleased with himself. He adjusted his expensive tie and told me that was a smart decision. He told me to make sure the ink was dry by Monday. I nodded slowly. I signaled to a passing waiter and quietly instructed him to box up 4 slices of our signature sweet potato cheesecake on the house for our guests. I handed the bags to Chloe, who took them without a word of thanks. I told them to have a wonderful weekend and watched them walk out the glass front doors, strutting like they had just conquered the world. Malik walked up beside me, staring at the door. He asked me why I did not just have them thrown out. He asked me why I let them speak to me that way in my own house. I looked at the folder in my hands and finally let that cold, sharp smile break across my face. I told Malik that sometimes when people are digging their own graves, the most polite thing you can do is hand them a bigger shovel. I turned around and walked back into my kitchen. The trap was set, and I was going to let them walk right into it. I pushed open the heavy oak door to my private office and let it click shut behind me, completely sealing off the rhythmic chaos of my kitchen. The room was perfectly quiet. I walked over to my desk, a solid slab of reclaimed walnut, and dropped Reginald's manila folder right in the center. I did not open it immediately. I just stared at the crisp white label bearing my name. They actually believed they could march into my territory and hand me an ultimatum. They believed it because, in their minds, I was still the exact same worthless failure they had discarded 5 years ago. To understand the sheer delusion of Reginald and Valerie, you have to understand their specific brand of black excellence. In some households, black excellence means breaking generational curses, building community wealth, and lifting as you climb. But in my family, that term was weaponized. It was a violently strict aesthetic. For my parents, success was never measured by character joy or actual financial literacy. It was measured entirely by proximity to wealth and, quite frankly, proximity to whiteness. My parents were royalty at our megachurch in Buckhead. Valerie never missed a Sunday service, always sitting in the second row wearing a custom silk suit and a hat that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Reginald sat beside her shaking hands with judges, real estate developers, and local politicians. They lived for the optics. They craved the validation of being seen as the elite, the untouchable, the fully assimilated. And then there was my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe was the absolute masterpiece they had molded from birth. She had the pageant queen smile, the perfectly relaxed hair, and a major in public relations that she treated exclusively as a degree in marrying rich. Chloe never had to work a real job a day in her life. She was groomed to be a trophy, and she played the part flawlessly. Her crowning achievement in my parents' eyes was bringing Connor home. Connor was exactly what Reginald and Valerie had prayed for. He was a white man from a family that supposedly held an 8-figure trust fund built on old generational wealth. He wore boat shoes, talked loudly over everyone else in the room, and treated every interaction like a business transaction he was winning. To my parents, Connor was not just a son-in-law, he was an acquisition. Having Connor in their family photos meant they had finally transcended. They flaunted him at church picnics and country club galas as the ultimate proof that our family had made it to the absolute top of the social hierarchy. Connor loved the attention, basking in the adoration of my parents while treating me with bare minimum tolerance. Meanwhile, I was the dark cloud ruining their perfect family portrait. I did not want to go to law school. I did not care about finding a husband with a trust fund. From the time I was 10 years old, my heart belonged completely to the kitchen. I was mesmerized by the history of our food, the science of flavor building the way a perfectly braised short rib could tell a story of survival and triumph. I wanted to study culinary arts. I wanted to honor the Southern Black culinary traditions that built this country. But to Reginald and Valerie, a Black woman choosing to work in a kitchen was an absolute disgrace. I will never forget the day I told my mother I wanted to be a chef. We were standing in her immaculate, rarely used kitchen. She dropped her wine glass on the marble counter and looked at me with pure disgust. She told me our ancestors fought and died to get out of the kitchen, and I was throwing my life away by trying to crawl right back in. She said I was choosing to be the help. From that day forward, that was exactly how they treated me. While Chloe was paraded around the living room and asked about her sorority events, I was banished to the back of the house. During their lavish holiday parties, Reginald would snap his fingers at me and order me to refill the chafing dishes or fetch more ice for Connor's whiskey. I was not a daughter. I was free catering. They hid me in the background because my passion for food embarrassed them. They wanted a lawyer they could brag about, and instead they got a girl who came home smelling like garlic, smoked hickory, and hard work. I lived my entire 20s isolated inside my own home. I watched my parents pour tens of thousands of dollars into Chloe's lavish lifestyle. They bought her a luxury car for graduation. They paid for her extravagant destination wedding in Charleston. They funded her designer wardrobe so she could keep up appearances with Connor's wealthy social circles. Every time I asked for support, even just a fraction of what they handed Chloe daily, I was met with harsh lectures about my life choices. Reginald would look down his nose at me and tell me that if I wanted to play cook, I had to fund it myself. They made sure I felt small. They made sure I knew that my worth in our family was tied directly to my willingness to conform to their toxic image of success. Because I chose the heat of a commercial kitchen over the sterile air of a corporate law firm, I was entirely expendable. I finally reached out and flipped open the manila folder on my desk. The legal jargon was dense, but the core demand was glaringly obvious. They wanted 20% of Aura transferred directly into an LLC controlled by Connor. They wanted to strip away the very thing I had built with my own two hands and hand it over to the white son-in-law who had mocked my cooking for a decade. The sheer entitlement was staggering. They had convinced themselves that I was still that desperate, approval-seeking daughter they could bully into submission. They truly believed I was weak because I chose not to scream at them in my dining room. They mistook my silence for fear. But the fear had burned out of my system a long time ago. As I scanned the predatory clauses Connor had clearly drafted himself, I felt a deep grounding sense of power. The little girl who used to cry in her bedroom because her mother was ashamed of her did not exist anymore. She died the night they threw me away. I closed the folder and shoved it aside. I did not need to read any more of their delusions. My past was a masterclass in emotional endurance, and it had prepared me perfectly for this exact moment. I stood up from my desk and walked over to my office window, looking down at the bustling Atlanta street below. My building, my street, my empire. They had absolutely no clue that the very ground they walked on tonight belonged to the daughter they threw away. And I was going to make sure the revelation destroyed their perfect facade permanently. I remember the exact moment the last fragile string connecting me to my family snapped. It was Thanksgiving 5 years ago. I was 30 years old and running on absolute fumes. I was working 3 different kitchen jobs, pulling double shifts and sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. My hands were covered in burn scars and my feet ached constantly. But I had a vision. I had spent 6 months drafting a bulletproof business plan for a food truck. I knew the Atlanta food scene was shifting, and I had mapped out every single cost, every supplier, and every projected margin. I did not want a handout. I just needed a co-signer for a modest $15,000 business loan because my credit was stretched to the absolute limit from culinary school debt. I brought my business plan to my parents' sprawling estate in Alpharetta. I printed it on heavy cardstock and placed it in a sleek leather binder. I was so nervous my hands were shaking, but I was also incredibly proud. I thought that if Reginald saw the numbers, the hard data, the clear path to profitability, he would finally respect me as an entrepreneur. I thought he would look past the apron and see a businesswoman. The dining room table was a grotesque display of wealth. Valerie had hired a private catering company to prepare the meal because she considered cooking for a large group beneath her. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier, and the room was filled with the booming laughter of Connor holding court. He was wearing a cashmere sweater, sipping my father's top-shelf bourbon and talking loudly about market disruption. Chloe sat beside him, nodding along as if he were a prophet. I waited until the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured. I took a deep breath, pulled my leather binder from my tote bag, and placed it on the table. The conversation died down. I looked my father right in the eyes and made my pitch. I was clear, concise, and passionate. I explained my concept for an elevated Southern fusion food truck. I laid out my profit margins. I explained the foot traffic data I had gathered. I asked him to co-sign the $15,000 loan, assuring him he would not have to pay a single dime. I just needed his signature to secure the interest rate. Reginald picked up the binder. He did not open it. He held it in his hands for a few seconds, feeling the weight of it. Then he looked at me and let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He tossed the binder back across the mahogany table. It slid and hit my water glass. He leaned back in his custom-upholstered chair and looked at me with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. He asked me why on earth he would attach his pristine financial reputation to a rolling grease trap. I tried to speak to point out the projected revenue, but he raised a hand and silenced me. He told me I was delusional. He said our family did not serve food out of trucks on the side of the road. He said I was 30 years old and still playing with pots and pans like a glorified kitchen maid. He told me it was an embarrassment that his daughter wanted to sweat over a deep fryer for spare change, while her sister was busy building a real life. The words hit me like physical blows. A glorified kitchen maid, in front of Chloe, in front of Connor, in front of my mother. I looked at Valerie, hoping for a shred of maternal defense. She just took a delicate sip of her coffee and adjusted her pearl necklace. She told me I needed to listen to my father and stop bringing my unrealistic fantasies to the dinner table. She said I was ruining a perfectly elegant evening with my begging. Chloe let out a soft, condescending sigh. She reached across the table and patted my hand with her perfectly manicured fingers. She told me not everyone was cut out for business. She said I should just stick to my restaurant shifts and maybe try to find a nice manager to marry. I sat there completely frozen. My chest was tight and my throat burned with unshed tears. I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. I quietly pulled my binder back across the table and placed it on my lap. I stared at the dark wood of the table, trying to make myself invisible. But the true cruelty of that night had not even begun. Not 20 minutes later, we relocated to the formal living room. Connor stretched out on the leather sofa, swirling the ice in his glass. He started talking about a new app idea he had. He had no business plan. He had no binder. He had no market research. He literally pulled a cocktail napkin from the bar cart and scribbled 3 buzzwords on it with a pen. He talked about synergy, blockchain integration, and disrupting the digital wellness space. It was a completely empty pitch filled with corporate jargon that meant absolutely nothing. He had 0 coding experience and 0 background in health tech. Reginald leaned forward, his eyes shining with intense admiration. He asked Connor how much seed money he needed to get the project off the ground. Connor casually shrugged his shoulders, taking another sip of bourbon. He said $100,000 would probably cover the initial development phase. Without a single second of hesitation, Reginald stood up, walked over to his mahogany writing desk, and pulled out his checkbook. He did not ask to see profit projections. He did not ask for collateral. He did not ask for a co-signer agreement. He simply uncapped his fountain pen and wrote a check for $100,000. He walked back over and handed the check to Connor. He slapped my brother-in-law on the shoulder and told him he was proud to invest in a visionary. He called Connor a true pioneer. I sat in the armchair in the corner of the room watching the exchange. I watched my father hand a white man $100,000 for a cocktail napkin dream less than an hour after he refused to co-sign a $15,000 loan for his own black daughter's meticulously planned business. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal paralyzed me. It was not just about the money. It was never about the money. It was about the fact that Reginald and Valerie fundamentally believed that Connor, simply by virtue of his race and his perceived status, was inherently a better investment than their own flesh and blood. They believed his empty buzzwords held more value than my decade of grueling labor and actual culinary skill. They wanted a tech CEO's son-in-law to brag about at their country club. They did not want a daughter who cooked. Connor folded the check, slipped it into the breast pocket of his cashmere sweater, and looked right at me. He gave me a small, patronizing smile. He told me to keep my head up. He said maybe one day I could cater one of his corporate launch parties. Something inside my chest snapped completely. The sorrow and the desperate need for their approval evaporated, leaving nothing behind but pure, blinding rage. I stood up from the armchair. My legs were shaking, but my spine was completely straight. I looked at the 4 of them celebrating their fraudulent excellence in that pristine, sterile living room. I finally understood the truth. I was never going to be enough for them, and trying to prove my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me was going to destroy my soul. I broke the pristine silence of that living room with a laugh that scraped the back of my throat. It was not a happy sound. It was a sharp, jagged noise that made Connor spill a drop of his bourbon onto the imported rug. All 4 of them turned to look at me as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking. I pointed directly at the folded check in Connor's pocket. I kept my voice terrifyingly level. I asked my father if he realized he had just handed $100,000 to a man who literally wrote 3 buzzwords on a cocktail napkin. I laid out the math for them in excruciating detail. I reminded them that I had presented a fully viable business plan, complete with market research, supplier contracts, and a clear path to profitability. I had asked for a simple signature to secure a $15,000 loan, a loan I would pay back myself. But my father had dismissed my decade of grueling labor in commercial kitchens as a cute little hobby. Meanwhile, He opened his wallet for a white man with zero coding experience, zero background in health technology, and absolutely nothing but a hollow pitch and a heavy dose of entitlement. I did not stop there. I looked at my mother sitting on her velvet sofa like a queen upon a throne, and I called out the rot at the center of her entire existence. I told her that her version of black excellence was a complete sham. It was nothing but a desperate performance for her country club friends and the mega-church congregation. I told her she did not care about hard work or building generational wealth. She only cared about proximity to whiteness and the illusion of elite status. I told her she was willing to bankroll a con artist just so she could brag about her tech CEO son-in-law at Sunday brunch while actively suffocating her own flesh and blood because my apron embarrassed her. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Reginald's face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. He stood up, towering over me, pointing a trembling finger at my face. He told me how dare I speak to him that way in his own house. He demanded that I apologize to Connor immediately. I did not move a single inch. I looked at Connor, who was leaning back with a smug, highly entertained smirk on his face, clearly enjoying the show. I told Reginald I would rather swallow broken glass than apologize to a fraud. That was when Valerie stood up. She smoothed the front of her silk blouse, walked over to me, and delivered the final fatal blow to our relationship. She did not yell. She used that quiet, deadly tone she reserved for women she wanted to utterly destroy. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She told me I was a jealous embarrassment to this family. She said I was a bitter, small-minded woman who could not handle the fact that my younger sister had secured a beautiful, successful life while I was still scrubbing grease off frying pans. She told me I was poisoning their home with my jealousy and my aggressive ghetto attitude. She looked me dead in the eyes and said I was a failure because I chose to be a failure. Chloe chimed in from the sofa, clutching Connor's arm like a frightened damsel. She told our parents to just let me go. She said I was clearly having some sort of mental breakdown and that I was ruining her holiday. Reginald did not need any more convincing. He marched over to the front door and threw it wide open. The cold November wind rushed into the immaculate foyer. He pointed out into the dark driveway and told me to get out. He said he was washing his hands of me. He told me not to call, not to visit, and not to expect a single dime from him ever again. He said he only had one daughter now, and she was sitting on the couch. I picked up my leather binder. I did not shed a single tear in front of them. I walked out the front door with my head held high, staring straight ahead. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me with a loud final thud. It sounded like a vault sealing shut. I walked to my beat-up sedan, got in, and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. As I sat there in the freezing car, my phone screen suddenly lit up the dark interior. A rapid-fire series of notifications flooded my screen. You have been removed from the Addams Family group chat. You have been removed from the holiday planning chat. I opened my social media apps. Valerie had blocked me. Reginald had blocked me. Chloe had blocked me. In the span of 3 minutes, they had systematically deleted my digital footprint from their lives. I was completely cut off. No warning, no cooling-off period. Total and absolute excommunication. The drive back to my cramped shared apartment was a blur of neon streetlights and blinding rage. But the true extent of their cruelty did not fully register until a few weeks later. I ran into an old family acquaintance at a grocery store in Midtown. She was a prominent member of the hospitality committee at my parents' megachurch. She gave me a look of deep condescending pity and grabbed my arm. She told me she was praying for my mental health. When I asked her what she was talking about, she revealed the narrative my mother had been peddling to anyone who would listen. Valerie had spent the last several weeks spinning a masterful, tragic tale to her country club friends and the entire church congregation. The official story was that I had suffered a severe emotional breakdown out of pure envy over Chloe's perfect marriage and Connor's massive business success. Valerie played the heartbroken, long-suffering mother perfectly. She told everyone that I had become dangerously volatile, that I demanded money to fund a chaotic lifestyle, and that I had eventually run away because I simply could not handle being around my sister's blessings. They did not just kick me out. They assassinated my character. They rewrote my entire history to make themselves the victims and me the villain. They painted me as an unstable, jealous failure who abandoned her loving family out of spite. They erased my hard work, my culinary degree, my ambitions, and my identity, replacing it all with a convenient lie that protected their precious social standing. They erased me without a second thought. They threw me away like trash, assuming I would just vanish into the background of Atlanta, struggling and invisible for the rest of my life. They assumed my spirit was broken. They assumed I would eventually come crawling back begging for forgiveness and begging to be let back into their gilded cage. They were wrong. That night, as I sat in my tiny apartment staring at the blank wall, I made a promise to myself. I was not going to break. I was not going to beg. I was going to take all the rage, all the betrayal, and all the humiliation they had poured over me, and I was going to use it as fuel. I was going to build an empire so massive, so undeniable, that it would cast a shadow over their entire fake existence. The excommunication was not a punishment, it was a liberation. They had cut the chains for me, and now there was absolutely nothing holding me back. I snapped back to the present reality, blinking away the phantom chill of that November night. I am standing in my immaculate kitchen at Aura. The stainless steel prep tables are gleaming under the bright industrial lights, and the air is thick with the scent of roasted garlic and reduction sauces. It is a beautiful scene. But getting here was not some glamorous cinematic montage with an upbeat soundtrack. It was 5 years of absolute, unadulterated hell. I did not just work hard. I worked like a woman with a pack of demons breathing down her neck. Because I did. I had 3 jobs. My alarm went off at 3 in the morning every single day. By 4, I was cracking eggs and flipping hash browns at a greasy spoon diner in Decatur, getting yelled at by impatient truck drivers. By 2 in the afternoon, I was sprinting across town to work the hotline at a high-volume corporate steakhouse. I took orders from mediocre executive chefs who did not possess a fraction of my palate, but I swallowed my pride because I needed their paycheck. And when that shift ended at midnight, I did not go home. I grabbed a mop and a bucket. I joined a nighttime commercial cleaning crew just to secure access to a wholesale supplier for my own ingredients. I was functioning on maybe 3 hours of sleep a night. Home was a loose concept. For the first 2 years of my exile, I did not have a real apartment. I could not afford one if I wanted to save the kind of capital I needed. I rented a small space in a shared commercial commissary kitchen in a rough industrial park on the outskirts of the city. I set up a cheap military-style canvas camping cot in a dry storage closet. My bed was wedged right between 50-pound sacks of flour and giant industrial cans of frying oil. The low, aggressive, rattling hum of the walk-in freezers was my lullaby. I woke up every single morning smelling like bleach, stale grease, and bone-deep exhaustion. My joints ached constantly. My hands were covered in fresh burns, cuts, and thick calluses. There were nights when the physical toll was so heavy, my knees threatened to buckle. There were nights when I wanted to just lie down on that freezing concrete floor and cry until I had nothing left. But every single time weakness tried to creep in, I saw my father standing in his plush living room. I saw him uncapping his fountain pen. I saw him handing a $100,000 check to Connor for a cocktail napkin pitch. That memory was a shot of pure, unadulterated adrenaline straight to my heart. It burned away the fatigue. It forced me to stand back up, tie my apron tighter, and get back to the cutting board. I absolutely refused to take out loans. I knew exactly how the traditional banking system treated Black women trying to build businesses. They throw predatory interest rates at us, bury us in red tape, and wait for us to default. I was not going to owe a single bank, a single investor, or a single family member anything. I lived on a strict cash diet. Every dollar I made from my 3 jobs was meticulously categorized in a physical envelope system. 10% for basic survival, 90% for the business fund. I kept the cash hidden in a fireproof lockbox shoved underneath my canvas cot. I watched those thin stacks of $20 bills slowly turn into thick bricks of hundreds. I did not buy new clothes. I did not go to the movies. I did not date. I ceased to be a normal human being with a social life. I became a machine programmed for one highly specific purpose. I took all of that blistering rage, all of that rejection, and I channeled it directly into my food. I started hosting underground pop-up dinners on my rare nights off. I called the concept Phoenix, a heavy-handed but necessary nod to burning my old life down and rising from the ashes. I hauled a rusted portable smoker and 2 folding tables to empty parking lots, brewery patios, and community centers all over Atlanta. I cooked the food my ancestors survived on, but I elevated it with relentless precision and classical French techniques. I perfected my braised oxtail recipe until the meat surrendered to a fork with zero resistance. I whipped sweet potatoes with white truffle oil until they were as smooth as silk. I smoked collard greens over hickory wood and enriched the broth until it tasted like liquid gold. I poured my soul onto every single paper plate I served. I did not have a marketing budget. I did not have a flashy public relations team sending out press releases to food blogs. I did not need them. The food spoke for itself. People started lining up around the block. First, it was 20 people shivering in the rain, then it was 50, then it was 200. They would wait for hours in abandoned parking lots just to get a plate before I completely sold out. I built a fiercely loyal community, a grassroots following of people who recognized passion and authenticity in every bite. It was during those grueling pop-up days that I met Malik. He was working the grill at a competitor's food truck, watching me manage a line of 200 people by myself. He saw my hustle. He walked over, picked up a pair of tongs, and started helping me plate without saying a word. He matched my speed. He matched my intensity. He did not ask for a cut of the profits that night. He just respected the grind. Malik became my first real hire, my right hand, and the first member of the actual family I was building for myself. Together we scaled the pop-up from folding tables to rented event spaces. We were turning massive profits, operating completely debt-free, and stacking cash with military discipline. I was no longer a glorified kitchen maid begging for a signature on a loan application. I was rapidly becoming a culinary force in the city. And the best part was that I was doing it entirely in the shadows. I was completely off my family's radar. They were busy attending country club luncheons and bragging about their fake overseas daughter, while the real one was silently building an empire right in their own backyard. We outgrew the pop-up phase the night I had to turn away 300 people in the pouring rain. I stood in a damp parking lot, looking at the line of customers wrapping around the block, and I knew the hustle had run its course. It was time to build a permanent throne. I took my lockbox heavy with the cash of 1,000 grueling nights, and I started hunting for a brick-and-mortar location. I did not want to just open a restaurant. I wanted to build a cathedral. I wanted to construct a sanctuary that honored the hands of the Black women who built the culinary foundation of the South. I named it Aura. I chose that name because I wanted the energy in the room to command absolute respect the second you cross the threshold. There would be no catering to the white gaze here. There would be no shrinking our flavors to make them more palatable for the country club crowds. Aura was going to be unapologetic, elevated, and deeply rooted in our history. Finding the physical space was a battle. I scoured Atlanta until I found a gutted, abandoned industrial building right in the heart of the city. It had massive arched windows and beautiful exposed brick, but the interior was an absolute disaster zone. Because I was operating strictly on the cash I had hoarded, I could not just write a massive check to a luxury contracting firm like Connor would have done. Malik and I did the demolition ourselves. We took sledgehammers to rotting drywall. We ripped out rusted pipes. We spent weeks on our hands and knees scrubbing decades of industrial grime off the original concrete floors, sealing them until they shined like black glass. I fought with the city over zoning permits, navigated the labyrinth of health department regulations, and aggressively bartered with suppliers to secure the best commercial-grade kitchen equipment without going a single penny into debt. I designed the dining room to reflect the exact opposite of my parents' sterile performative wealth. I wanted genuine warmth and earned luxury. I paid in cash for custom velvet booths in deep emerald green. I hung massive amber chandeliers that cast a seductive, intimate glow over the polished mahogany tables. Every detail was meticulously curated to make my guests feel like royalty. Opening night was a blur of pure adrenaline and absolute terror. We unlocked the doors on a rainy Tuesday in early October. I had no safety net. If Aura failed, I had nothing to fall back on. I had no trust fund, no rich husband, and certainly no father willing to write $100,000 check to save me from ruin. Every single plate that left my kitchen had to be absolutely flawless. Those first 3 months nearly broke us. There were terrifying nights when the dining room was only half full. I watched my hard-earned cash reserves dwindle to keep the lights on and pay my staff. Fear whispered in my ear constantly. Fear told me Reginald was right, that I was just playing with pots and pans, that I was destined to fail. But I refused to listen. I refused to compromise the vision. I did not dumb down the menu. I did not offer cheap happy hour specials just to get bodies in seats. I demanded excellence from my kitchen staff, and I demanded respect for the cuisine. Malik and I practically lived in that building. We were working 100-hour weeks without breaking a sweat. We would finish the dinner service at midnight, deep clean the kitchen until 2 in the morning, sleep on the velvet banquettes in the dining room for a few hours, and wake up at dawn to meet the local farmers delivering our fresh produce. My feet bled inside my shoes. My eyes were perpetually bloodshot. But every time I felt the exhaustion threatening to pull me under, I plated another masterpiece. I tasted the rich, smoky depth of my collard green pot liquor, the perfect crisp on the fried green tomatoes, and the fire in my chest reignited. We poured our absolute souls onto those pristine white plates. The major breakthrough happened on a random Thursday evening. I did not know the preeminent food critic in the Southeast was sitting quietly at table 4. He ordered the full tasting menu. He tasted the charred okra with smoked turkey neck reduction. He ate the pan-seared red snapper over stone-ground heirloom grits. He finished with the bourbon-glazed peach cobbler. I treated his ticket exactly the same way I treated every other ticket in my restaurant, with my relentless, obsessive pursuit of perfection. He paid his bill and left without introducing himself. The review dropped that Sunday, and it shifted the axis of my entire universe. The critic did not just praise the food. He crowned Aura as a culinary revelation. He wrote a sprawling feature calling my menu a profound love letter to Southern Black history, executed with the technical brilliance of a Michelin-starred veteran. He described the flavors as bold, fearless, and deeply emotional. The impact was immediate and explosive. Our reservation phone line started ringing on Monday morning, and it literally did not stop. My website crashed twice in one day from the sheer volume of traffic. We went from a steady neighborhood spot to the absolute hardest reservation to get in the entire city of Atlanta in 48 hours. The waitlist stretched to 3 months. People were lining up outside the doors before we even opened, just hoping for a cancellation at the bar. Suddenly, the exact same high society elite who sat in the VIP pews at my parents' church were begging my hostess to squeeze them in for a Tuesday night dinner. Mayor's a list. Actors, professional athletes, and corporate titans were clamoring to get into my dining room. I had built a multi-million-dollar empire from the ashes of my brutal excommunication. I was 35 years old, operating a wildly profitable fine dining establishment, and I owned every single piece of my success. The girl they threw away had become a queen in her own city, and my family remained completely oblivious to the throne I was sitting on. It was not enough to just run the hottest restaurant in the city. When you grow up in a family that uses money as a weapon to keep you compliant, you learn very quickly that renting your throne means someone else can always evict you from it. I was pulling in massive revenue. I was fielding calls from national food critics and catering high-profile celebrity events. But I was still writing a hefty lease check every single month to a commercial real estate firm. I was still operating on someone else's land. I wanted absolute control. I wanted the dirt beneath my feet. I needed to know that no matter what happened, nobody could ever tell me to pack up my knives and leave. 2 years ago, the opportunity of a lifetime dropped right into my lap. The commercial block that housed Aura and several other businesses hit a massive financial wall. The property management group had over-leveraged themselves on a disastrous development deal in Midtown. Whispers started circulating through the local restaurant associations that the entire block was going into foreclosure. The managing partner, the exact same man my father claimed to play golf with every Sunday, was quietly panicking. He was desperately trying to liquidate assets to save his own skin before the bank swooped in and seized everything. I did not waste a single second. I picked up my phone and called attorney Sterling. Sterling was a shark in a tailored three-piece suit. He was a ruthless, brilliant legal mind who specialized in high-stakes commercial real estate for Black entrepreneurs in Atlanta. He did not play nice, he did not make compromises, and he was fiercely protective of his clients and their assets. I walked into his downtown office, dropped a massive portfolio of Aura's financial statements on his heavy glass desk, and told him I wanted to buy my building, not just my unit. The entire commercial block. Sterling looked at the numbers, looked at me and smiled a cold, calculating smile. He told me that if we played our cards right, we could acquire the property for pennies on the dollar before it ever went to public auction. But he also warned me about the optics. He knew my history. He knew that if my family or their social circle caught wind of my success, they would swoop in like vultures. They would try to claim a piece of the pie or worse. Reginald would leverage his country club connections to sabotage the deal out of pure spite just to keep me in my place. I told Sterling I needed total anonymity. I needed to become a ghost in the financial system. So we went to work. We spent 3 weeks drafting airtight legal documents to create a blind limited liability company. I chose the name Phoenix Holdings. It was the perfect inside joke, a quiet nod to the underground pop-up that birthed my empire, and a silent promise that I had risen from the ashes my family left me in. Through Phoenix Holdings, my identity as the primary shareholder was completely shielded behind layers of ironclad corporate privacy laws. On paper, the buyer was just a faceless corporate entity with deep pockets. We made a cash-heavy, highly aggressive offer to the desperate property management group. They were bleeding capital so fast, they did not even care who was behind the LLC. They just saw a lifeline and grabbed it with both hands. We closed the deal in under 30 days. I sat in a sleek leather chair in Sterling's boardroom and signed my name on the final closing documents. I transferred millions of dollars from my business accounts, completely draining my hard-earned reserves, but securing something infinitely more valuable: generational wealth, true untouchable independence. That is the real reason I had to bite the inside of my cheek until it bled to keep from laughing when Reginald marched into my dining room tonight. He stood there puffing out his chest, bragging about his connections, slamming that manila folder on my table. He threatened to call his golf buddy on Monday morning to have my lease pulled. He looked at me with such immense satisfaction, truly believing he was holding a loaded gun to my head. His golf buddy has not owned this property in 24 months. His golf buddy took my buyout money and retired to a condo in Boca Raton to hide from his remaining creditors. If Reginald picks up his phone on Monday morning and dials the owner of this building, my personal cell phone is going to ring. I am the landlord. I own the brick. I own the mortar. I own the parking lot out back. Every single time a tenant on this commercial block pays their rent, the money flows directly into an account controlled by the daughter Reginald threw out into the cold November night. The sheer poetic justice of it is almost intoxicating. My parents spent my entire life obsessed with the illusion of power. They worshipped men in suits who possessed the ability to destroy people with a single phone call. They raised Chloe to be a decorative accessory to a man with a trust fund, believing that was the pinnacle of security. They kicked me to the curb because my ambition was too gritty, too blue-collar, too dirty for their pristine country club image. Yet here I am. While they were busy maintaining a fake narrative and attending church galas, I was quietly buying up the city. I was playing Monopoly with real buildings while they were busy playing dress-up. The absolute disconnect between their perception of me and the reality of my net worth is staggering. They walked into Aura expecting to find a desperate, struggling cook drowning in debt. They expected me to fall to my knees and thank them for the scraps they were offering through Connor's fraudulent contract. They did not realize they had walked into a fortress built by a woman who holds all the keys. When Reginald threatened to have me thrown out on the street, he handed me the ultimate victory. He proved that he had not changed. He proved that he would still use his power to crush me if he could. But the power dynamic has completely inverted. I am not the vulnerable 30-year-old girl begging for a $15,000 loan anymore. I am the apex predator in this scenario. As I walked back into my bustling kitchen tonight, leaving them to eat their complimentary sweet potato cheesecake, I knew the trap was set perfectly. I watched them through the small glass window of the kitchen doors, looking so smug and victorious at their reserved table. But the masterpiece of this entire setup was not just that I owned my own restaurant building. The true masterpiece, the detail that made this entire 5-year journey worth every single burn and scar, was who else was paying me rent. The architecture of the commercial block I purchased was a classic mixed-use space. On the ground floor, Aura anchored the corner with its massive arched windows and heavy double doors. But directly above my dining room, accessed by a private glass elevator in the lobby, were 3 floors of premium executive office suites. When Phoenix Holdings acquired the building, we inherited all the existing commercial leases. My property management team sent me the updated tenant manifest a week after closing. I remember sitting in my office poring over the list of businesses occupying my upper floors. There were boutique law firms, boutique marketing agencies, and right there on the second floor occupying Suite 200 was a company called Apex Vision Consulting. Apex Vision Consulting was Connor. When Chloe first married him, he used Reginald's initial $100,000 check to lease that exact premium corner suite. He furnished it with imported Italian leather chairs, a fully stocked bourbon bar, and a massive mahogany desk. He wanted to project the ultimate image of a thriving, untouchable tech venture capitalist. My parents ate it up. They bragged endlessly to their church congregation about Connor's sprawling downtown office. They told everyone he was commanding a global empire right from the heart of Atlanta. The truth was entirely different. I had my property manager pull the detailed payment history for Suite 200. Connor was not a global visionary. Connor was a terrible tenant. For the first 2 years of his lease, his rent payments were erratic, always arriving at the absolute last possible second before late fees kicked in. But over the past 8 months, his financial situation had taken a severe nosedive. The erratic payments stopped completely. As of this exact moment, while he stood in my restaurant demanding 20% of my equity, Connor was precisely 90 days delinquent on his rent. He owed my holding company 3 months of back rent, common area maintenance fees, and a mountain of compounding late penalties. He was officially in default. The property management software had already auto-generated his eviction warning. I just had not authorized them to post it to his door yet. Finding out that Connor was a deadbeat tenant was amusing, but it did not explain the full scope of the audacity I had just witnessed. If Connor was the heir to a massive generational trust fund, a few months of commercial rent in Atlanta should have been pocket change. A true trust fund baby does not dodge calls from property managers over a basic lease agreement. Something was deeply wrong with his financial profile. I called attorney Sterling and asked him to run a quiet, fully legal commercial background check on Apex Vision Consulting and its managing director. I wanted to know exactly who was sitting in my restaurant making demands. Sterling is a man who operates with surgical precision. Within 48 hours, he called me back with a dossier that completely shattered the illusion my family had spent 5 years worshipping. There was no trust fund. There was no generational wealth. Connor's family had money back in the 1980s, but his father had squandered it all on failed real estate ventures before Connor even graduated college. The narrative of the wealthy white savior marrying into our family was a complete fabrication. Connor was a grifter. He used the perception of his race and his family name to secure meetings, but he had absolutely no capital to back it up. His consulting firm generated zero actual revenue. He was essentially running a hollow shell company using my father's initial investment to pay himself a salary and lease an office. He did not need just to maintain the facade. When that initial $100,000 dried up, Connor did not get a real job. He simply went back to the well. He went back to Reginald. Sterling dug into public property records and found the missing pieces of the puzzle. My parents' sprawling, immaculate estate in Alpharetta, the very house they kicked me out of, had been remortgaged. Twice. Reginald and Valerie had systematically drained their own home equity to keep Connor's business afloat. They were quietly bleeding out their retirement savings to fund Chloe's designer wardrobe, Connor's luxury car leases, and the fake executive lifestyle they needed to parade around their country club. They were utterly terrified of the social humiliation that would come if their church community found out their perfect golden child had married a broke fraud. They had literally bankrupted themselves to protect their proximity to whiteness. They drained their own generational wealth to fund a white man's delusion while simultaneously treating their black daughter, who was actually building an empire, like a lowly servant. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The puzzle pieces locked together with absolute terrifying clarity. Reginald did not march into Aura tonight because he genuinely believed Connor could optimize my business. He did not slam that contract on my table because he wanted to be a tough corporate mentor. He did it because they are completely broke. They are drowning in debt. The banks are likely circling their estate in Alpharetta. Connor is facing imminent eviction from his office space. The walls of their gilded cage are caving in rapidly. They targeted me because they finally realized I am the only person in our entire bloodline who actually possesses liquid capital. They must have seen a recent local business magazine feature that highlighted Aura's success. The article conservatively estimated my annual revenue at $4 million. That number must have sent them into an absolute tailspin of desperation. They looked at the daughter they discarded, the daughter they called a jealous embarrassment, and they saw a life raft. But instead of coming to me with humility, instead of apologizing for 5 years of silence and cruelty, they reverted to their standard playbook. They chose intimidation, extortion, and entitlement. They actually believed they could bully me into signing over a fifth of my multi-million-dollar company to save their fraudulent son-in-law from the consequences of his own incompetence. I sat in my office chair, letting the sheer magnitude of their desperation wash over me. It was the most profound, poetic justice I had ever witnessed. They had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure because I did not fit their narrow, toxic definition of excellence. They threw me away because I wanted to wear a chef coat instead of a business suit, and now the very same hands they claimed would never amount to anything were holding the deeds to their entire reality. I hold the lease to Connor's fake empire. I hold the equity they desperately need to save their home. I hold all the cards. They handed me the knife and politely asked me to press it to their throats. A deep, resonant calm settled into my bones. I was not angry anymore. Anger is an emotion reserved for people who still have power over you. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical anticipation. They had given me the weekend to review their fraudulent contract. They thought they had backed me into a corner with the threat of calling my landlord. They thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers. I picked up my phone and drafted a highly strategic text message to my father. I did not sound arrogant. I played the part they desperately needed me to play. I typed out a message saying that his threat to call the landlord had really shaken me. I told him I was overwhelmed by the business debt and that I realized I was in over my head. I said I was ready to sign the 20% over to Connor, but I wanted to do it properly. I invited them to return to Aura next Friday night. I told him I was hosting a private VIP tasting event and that I wanted the whole family there to celebrate our new business partnership. I made sure to casually mention that the mayor would be in attendance, along with a significant portion of their elite church congregation. I knew my parents. I knew their fatal flaw was their absolute addiction to public validation. The opportunity to stand in a room full of Atlanta's high society and publicly take credit for my restaurant's success would be completely irresistible to them. They would not be able to stay away. I hit send and watched the message turn green. The bait was in the water. I set my phone down on the desk, stood up, and smoothed out my chef coat. I had a dinner service to finish. I had a kitchen to run. And I had exactly 7 days to orchestrate the most spectacular, devastating eviction Atlanta high society had ever seen. Saturday morning brought the kind of quiet that only exists in a commercial kitchen before the fires are lit. I was sitting at my walnut desk sipping a black coffee and reviewing the inventory sheets for the upcoming week. The adrenaline from Friday night had settled into a sharp, focused hum in my veins. My phone sat face down next to my coffee mug, perfectly silent. I knew my text message had landed like a grenade in their laps. I knew they were currently sitting in their over-leveraged Alpharetta estate celebrating what they believed was my complete surrender. Then the silence broke. My phone vibrated against the wood. A single notification, ping. 10 seconds later, it vibrated again. Then, it started buzzing in a relentless, unbroken rhythm that made the ceramic coffee mug rattle. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. A cascade of alerts flooded my notification center. Yelp, Google, OpenTable, TripAdvisor. Every single platform connected to Aura was lighting up simultaneously. I opened my restaurant management dashboard and watched the analytics plummet in real time. My pristine 5-star rating, which I had bled to maintain for 2 years, was taking a massive coordinated hit. I clicked into the review section. The first one was posted by an account with 0 previous history. It claimed the braised oxtail was severely undercooked and caused immediate violent food poisoning. I let out a dry, hollow laugh. You literally cannot undercook my oxtail unless you serve it completely raw. It braises for 6 hours until the meat collapses at the mere suggestion of a fork. I scrolled down to the next one. This user claimed they found rodent droppings baked into our signature cornbread. Another review stated the waitstaff was incredibly hostile, aggressive, and used racially charged language against white patrons. The next 10 reviews followed the exact same pattern. They used extreme buzzwords designed to trigger health department audits and scare away high society clientele. They mentioned filthy bathrooms, roaches, terrible management, and raw chicken. It was an orchestrated digital slaughter. I did not have to hire a private investigator to figure out who was holding the match. The timing was entirely too perfect. My family had received my text message offering to sign over 20% of my equity on Friday night. In their minds, my willingness to negotiate meant I was weak. It meant the armor was cracking. Reginald and Connor operated on the philosophy of absolute domination. They did not just want my signature on a contract. They wanted me broken, trembling, and begging for their mercy. They decided to apply maximum pressure over the weekend to ensure I did not back out of our Friday FIP tasting arrangement. They wanted to terrorize my business so severely that by the time Friday rolled around, I would gladly hand over the keys just to make the bleeding stop. The door to my office suddenly slammed open, hitting the rubber wall stop with a violent thud. Malik stood in the doorway. He was still wearing his street clothes, having just walked in through the back alley entrance, but his chest was heaving. He held his phone in a death grip, his knuckles completely white. He marched up to my desk and threw his phone down next to mine. He asked me if I was seeing the absolute garbage being posted online. His voice was shaking with a furious, protective rage. Malik treats this kitchen with the exact same reverence I do. He scrubs those stainless steel prep tables until they shine. He inspects every single delivery of produce. He knows the waitstaff by name and he treats them like family. To see our sanctuary dragged through the digital mud by anonymous cowards felt like a physical assault to him. He started pacing the length of my office, demanding we release a statement. He wanted to go on Instagram Live. He wanted to pull our kitchen security footage to prove our sanitation standards. He wanted to reply to every single fake review and threaten legal action for defamation. He was ready to go to absolute war. I stayed perfectly still in my chair. I let him vent his frustration. I let him pace the floor until the initial spike of adrenaline burned off. Then I stood up, walked over to my espresso machine, and poured him a cup of black coffee. I handed it to him and pointed to the leather chair across from my desk. I told him to sit down and breathe. Malik looked at me like I had lost my mind. He asked me how I could be so calm while our livelihood was being burned to the ground. I leaned against the edge of my desk and looked him dead in the eyes. I told him we were not going to post a statement. We were not going to reply to a single comment. We were going to do absolutely nothing. I explained the psychology of the people we were dealing with. I laid out exactly who Connor and Chloe were. I told Malik that responding to these reviews was exactly what they wanted. They were sitting behind their screens, desperately hitting refresh, waiting for Aura to flinch. They wanted a chaotic emotional response. They wanted me to scramble. If we went on social media and started defending ourselves, we would look guilty, defensive, and out of control. We would be playing their game on their turf. I told Malik that real power does not scream. Real power observes documents and waits for the perfect moment to strike. I pulled out my laptop and opened a secure encrypted messaging app. I sent a direct message to Attorney Sterling. I included screenshots of the reviews and the timestamps. I asked him to have his cybersecurity contact run a quiet background trace on the accounts. Within 45 minutes, my secure inbox pinged with a response. Sterling had forwarded a preliminary report. I opened the file and handed the laptop to Malik. The digital trail was so incredibly sloppy, it was actually insulting. Connor touted himself as a visionary tech executive, but his sabotage tactics were strictly amateur hour. He had not even bothered to use a sophisticated proxy network or a professional bot farm. The cyber investigator easily traced the creation of the fake accounts. Half of the IP addresses linked directly back to a residential router in Alpharetta, the exact location of my parents' estate. The other half traced back to a commercial IP address. I checked the commercial location on the report. It was the second-floor office suite of Phoenix Holdings. Connor was literally sitting in my building using my wireless infrastructure to leave fake reviews on my restaurant. Malik read the report and let out a long, slow breath. The furious tension in his shoulders dropped, replaced by a cold, calculating realization. He looked up at me and asked what the next move was. I closed the laptop and locked it in my desk drawer. I told him the next move was to prep the kitchen for the biggest Saturday night service we had ever executed. We were going to ignore the digital noise. We were going to let them dig their grave 10 feet deeper. I explained that Connor and Chloe were operating from a place of intense desperation. They did not value Aura. They did not care about the culinary arts or the community we had built. They viewed this restaurant as a piggy bank they could smash open to pay off their massive debts. They were willing to destroy the very asset they were trying to steal just to force my hand. That level of desperation makes people careless. I needed them careless. I needed them feeling powerful, arrogant, and completely untouchable when they walked through my doors on Friday night. I told Malik to go back to the kitchen and tie his apron. I instructed him to tell the staff to completely ignore their phones. We were not going to let anonymous internet trolls dictate the energy in our sanctuary. We were going to cook. We were going to serve our guests with the exact same flawless precision that put us on the map in the first place. Malik gave me a single sharp nod. The panic was gone from his eyes, replaced by a dangerous, focused loyalty. He understood the assignment. We were not just running a dinner service tonight. We were laying the groundwork for an execution. He walked out of the office and I listened to his heavy boots hit the concrete floor of the kitchen. I heard him clapping his hands, calling the line cooks to attention. I heard the familiar, comforting sound of steel pans hitting the industrial burners. I picked up my coffee mug and took a slow sip. The bitter dark roast tasted perfect. I looked at the manila folder still sitting on the corner of my desk. Let them leave their fake reviews. Let them celebrate their petty little sabotage. They were spending their Saturday morning hiding behind fake screen names, trying to tear down a black woman who had already survived the absolute worst they had to offer. They thought they were applying pressure. They had no idea they were just wrapping the rope tighter around their own necks. I finished my coffee, turned off the notifications on my phone, and walked out into my kitchen. It was time to get to work. Tuesday morning prep is a sacred ritual at Aura. After the relentless, bone-crushing marathon of the weekend service, Tuesday is when we reset the board. The kitchen is quiet, save for the rhythmic, hypnotic chopping of chef knives hitting butcher block cutting boards. Malik and I are at our stations by 6 in the morning, receiving the fresh deliveries from our local farmers. I am inspecting a crate of vibrant earth, crusted collard greens, checking the crispness of the leaves, while Malik is carefully butchering a massive side of beef. The air smells like fresh citrus, sharp onions, and the faint, lingering hickory smoke from the pits out back. It is a sanctuary. It is a well-oiled machine operating at maximum efficiency. At exactly 8:45, the heavy glass doors at the front of the restaurant rattled. We were not open to the public for another 8 hours. The hostess was not even on the clock yet. I wiped my hands on a pristine white towel and walked out of the kitchen, fully expecting to find a confused delivery driver or a lost tourist. Instead, I found a man in a rumpled tan suit standing in my foyer holding a metal clipboard. A bright Silver City of Atlanta Health Department badge hung from a lanyard around his neck. In the restaurant industry, an unannounced visit from the health department is enough to send a cold sweat down the spine of even the most seasoned executive chef. It is the ultimate wild card. A single misplaced towel, an unlabeled plastic container, or a refrigerator running 2 degrees too warm can result in catastrophic point deductions. But I did not sweat. I did not panic. I simply stood up straight and walked over to greet him. He introduced himself as Inspector Higgins. He did not smile. He had the weary, cynical demeanor of a man who spent his life walking into nightmare kitchens and shutting them down. He looked past me, scanning the velvet booths and the amber chandeliers, before looking down at his clipboard. He informed me that he was here to conduct an emergency, unannounced inspection of the premises. He stated that the city had received an urgent anonymous tip late Monday afternoon. The caller claimed that Aura was suffering from a massive, uncontrollable rodent infestation. The tipster specifically alleged that rat droppings were visible in the dining room and that our dry storage was completely compromised. I felt a sharp, sudden spike of amusement hit the back of my throat. I had to actively force my face to remain completely neutral. A rat infestation. It was almost insulting how lazy their tactics were. Connor and Chloe had failed to break me with their coordinated fake online reviews over the weekend. The reservations did not drop. The phone did not stop ringing. So they decided to escalate. They dialed the city, hoping a surprise health inspection would result in a humiliating shutdown, or at the very least a hefty fine and a yellow placard on my front window. They truly believed I operated my multi-million-dollar establishment with the same sloppy, careless incompetence they applied to their own lives. I looked Inspector Higgins right in the eyes, gave him a warm, professional smile, and told him he was more than welcome to inspect every single square inch of my property. I extended my arm, gesturing toward the swinging doors of the kitchen, and personally invited him to step inside. When we pushed through those doors, the bustling noise of the prep cooks immediately stopped. Malik looked up from his butcher station, spotted the city badge, and instantly understood the assignment. He did not scramble. He did not frantically start hiding things. He simply stepped back, wiped down his station with a sanitized cloth, and stood at attention. I told Inspector Higgins to take his time. He started in the dry storage room. This was the exact spot the anonymous caller claimed was overrun with rodents. He clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight and shined it into the darkest corners of the room. He found absolutely nothing but perfection. Every single bag of flour, sugar, and rice was securely transferred into heavy-duty, airtight commercial-grade plastic bins. Every container was meticulously labeled and dated with masking tape and Sharpie perfectly facing outward. All shelving units were placed exactly 6 inches off the floor and 2 inches away from the walls, fully compliant with the strictest municipal codes. The floor was spotless. There was not a single speck of dust, let alone a rodent dropping. He moved to the walk-in refrigerators. He checked the digital temperature logs we keep clipped to the heavy steel doors. We log our temperatures every 4 hours without fail. He stuck his own calibrated thermometer into a pan of braising liquid. It read the exact, perfect, safe temperature. He inspected the raw meat storage, noting that all poultry was stored on the absolute bottom shelves, eliminating any possibility of cross-contamination. Malik walked beside us, pulling out invoices and pest control records. We employ the most expensive, aggressive commercial pest control service in the state of Georgia. They visit weekly. Malik handed the inspector a pristine binder showing 12 months of flawless zero-activity pest reports. For the next 90 minutes, Inspector Higgins checked the sanitation buckets, the dishwasher temperatures, the employee hand-washing stations, and the grease traps. He looked under the stoves behind the fryers and inside the ice machines. He tried to find a single flaw. He tried to find a reason to validate the urgent anonymous tip that pulled him away from his office on a Tuesday morning. He found absolutely nothing. My kitchen was cleaner than most hospital operating rooms. When the inspection was finally complete, we moved into my office. Inspector Higgins sat down at my walnut desk and pulled a fresh carbon copy inspection sheet from his clipboard. The cynical, weary demeanor had completely vanished. He looked at me with genuine, undisguised professional respect. He told me that in his 15 years of inspecting restaurants in Atlanta, he could count on one hand the number of kitchens that operated with this level of immaculate discipline. He said it was a master class in culinary management. He clicked his pen and wrote a massive, undeniable 100 at the top of the form. A perfect A score. 0 violations, 0 infractions, 0 warnings. He ripped off the yellow copy and handed it to me. I thanked him gracefully, maintaining my professional composure, though my blood was singing with triumph. As he packed his forms back into his battered leather briefcase, he paused. He let out a small, tired sigh, shaking his head. He looked at me and said that sometimes success breeds nasty, vindictive competitors. He told me that people get jealous of a packed dining room, and they try to use city resources to drag successful business owners down. He zipped his briefcase shut and mentioned that the department usually takes anonymous tips with a grain of salt, but they are legally obligated to investigate severe claims. He said the caller had been incredibly agitated on the phone, demanding immediate action. Then, as he walked toward my office door, he paused and made an offhand comment. He said the caller tried to remain anonymous, but the dispatch operator required a name for the internal log before transferring the urgent call. The man had aggressively identified himself as a concerned neighboring business owner. Inspector Higgins looked at his notes one last time and casually dropped the name. He said the tip came from a Mr. Connor. He wished me a wonderful day, stepped out of my office, and walked out the front doors of Aura. Malik, who had been standing quietly by the bookshelf, let out a sharp, incredulous bark of laughter. He looked at me, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. Connor actually used his real name. The man claiming to be a high-powered elite corporate consultant, the man who wanted to take over my business accounting because he was a professional, had called a government agency to file a fraudulent report and gave them his actual first name. He was arrogant enough to believe he was untouchable, but stupid enough to leave a direct, verifiable trail leading right back to his own desk. He probably made the call from the second floor of my own building. The sheer incompetence was breathtaking. They were trying to play a high-stakes game of extortion, but they were operating with the tactical awareness of angry toddlers. They thought they were applying maximum pressure to force me into signing that 20% equity contract on Friday night. Instead, they were just handing me a silver platter piled high with actionable documented evidence of targeted harassment and business sabotage. I looked down at the perfect 100 score on the yellow carbon paper. The trap I set on Friday was no longer just about exposing their fake wealth. It was now about completely dismantling them. I picked up my phone and dialed Attorney Sterling. It was time to pull their financial records and set the final piece of the execution in motion. I had a tasting event to host, and I needed my eviction notices printed on heavy, expensive cardstock. I left Malik in charge of the lunch preparation and drove straight to downtown Atlanta. Attorney Sterling operates out of a sleek, high-rise building in Buckhead. The elevator ride to the 40th floor made my ears pop. Walking into his office is like walking into a vault. The space smells intensely of rich mahogany, expensive leather, and pure intimidation. I bypassed his receptionist with a quick nod and marched directly into his private boardroom. Sterling was already waiting for me at the head of a massive conference table, meticulously sorting through thick stacks of printed financial documents. He looked up as I entered, adjusted his silver wire-rimmed glasses, and offered me a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the highly calculated smile of an apex predator who had just cornered his prey. I took a seat in a heavy leather chair across from him. Before he could speak, I told him about the morning I just had. I explained the unannounced health inspection, the perfect 100 score, and the absolute absurdity of Connor using his real name to call in a fake rat infestation. Sterling let out a dry, harsh bark of laughter. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers together. He told me that arrogance consistently breeds stupidity, and Connor was proving to be the most arrogant, stupid individual he had investigated in a decade. Sterling slid a thick black binder across the polished wood table. He told me to open it and look at the numbers. I pulled the binder toward me and flipped back the heavy cover. I expected to find some maxed-out credit cards, or perhaps a defaulted business loan. I expected signs of a struggling entrepreneur. What I found instead was a complete and utter financial massacre. Sterling walked me through the documents line by line. Connor's infamous trust fund, the absolute holy grail of my parents' elite social standing, was completely non-existent. His family wealth was a relic of the 1980s, entirely wiped out by a series of disastrous commercial real estate investments decades before Connor even graduated college. The initial $100,000 check Reginald wrote to Connor in our living room 5 years ago was the only liquid capital Connor had ever actually possessed. He used my father's money to lease the premium office space upstairs in my building. He used it to lease a luxury vehicle he could not afford and to buy a highly exclusive membership to my parents' country club. He built an entire house of cards on Reginald's dime. And when that initial cash burned up within 18 months, Connor did not go out and get a real job. He simply went back to my father and asked for more. This is where the sheer magnitude of my father's delusion became terrifyingly clear. Sterling pulled out a copy of a property deed and placed it on top of the pile. It was the deed to my parents' sprawling, immaculate estate in Alpharetta. The house they used to host extravagant church dinners. The house they literally kicked me out of 5 years ago. According to the official banking documents laid out in front of me, Reginald had remortgaged the property. He did not just do it once. He remortgaged his home twice. He systematically stripped every single ounce of equity out of his own house just to keep Connor and Chloe living in a fantasy world. I stared at the highlighted bank transfers in absolute shock. Reginald was actively bleeding out his retirement savings to pay for Chloe's designer handbags, Connor's exorbitant office rent, and their lavish European vacations. My parents were utterly terrified that their elite mega-church congregation would find out their perfect golden child had married a broke fraud. To prevent that social humiliation, my parents had effectively bankrupted themselves. They deliberately destroyed their own generational wealth to protect their proximity to whiteness and status. And now the bill had finally come due. The mortgages were severely underwater. The bank was preparing to initiate formal foreclosure proceedings on the Alpharetta estate within the next 60 days. Connor was facing imminent eviction from his office space. They were drowning in a sea of debt they had created themselves. I looked up at Sterling. The burning question I had carried since Friday night finally spilled out of my mouth. I asked him why they chose now. Why did they wait 5 years of total absolute silence to suddenly walk into my dining room and demand 20% of my business? Sterling did not say a word. He simply reached into his briefcase and slid one final piece of paper across the desk. It was a glossy color printout from a highly prominent Atlanta business magazine published just 3 weeks ago. The cover story featured the rising culinary stars of the city. There was a massive full-page spread on Aura. The photograph showed me standing in front of my restaurant with my arms crossed, wearing my custom chef coat looking like absolute royalty. The article detailed my journey, my menu, and my explosive impact on the local food scene. But more importantly, the financial analysts who wrote the piece had done their math. They conservatively estimated Aura's annual revenue at $4 million. I stared at my own face on the glossy page, and everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. That magazine feature was the catalyst. Reginald and Valerie must have seen that magazine sitting on a table at their country club. They read the number $4 million and realized the daughter they had violently discarded was sitting on a gold mine. They saw their own financial ruin accelerating toward them at warp speed, and then they saw my face looking back at them from a publication they respected. They did not look at that article and feel a single shred of parental pride. They did not feel a heavy wave of remorse for throwing me out into the freezing November night. They looked at my immense hard-earned success and saw nothing but a life raft. They targeted me because I was the only person in our entire bloodline with actual liquid capital. But instead of coming to me with humility, instead of apologizing for 5 years of absolute silence and cruelty, they reverted to their standard toxic playbook. They chose extortion. They fabricated a fraudulent contract, marched into my restaurant during my busiest dinner service, and tried to bully me into signing over a fifth of my company to save their fake tech executive son-in-law. I closed the black binder. The cold, clinical anticipation I had felt on Friday night hardened into absolute unbreakable steel. I was not just dealing with bad parents anymore, I was dealing with parasites. I looked across the table at Sterling and told him I was not just going to evict Connor. I was going to publicly humiliate them in front of the exact audience they had destroyed their lives to impress. I needed the legal paperwork drafted immediately. I wanted the eviction notices, the cease and desist orders for extortion, and the formal trespass warnings printed on the heaviest, most expensive cardstock he had in his office. Sterling smiled, leaning back in his chair and adjusting his cuffs. He told me the documents were already being printed. He knew exactly what kind of war we were waging. I stood up, smoothed out my clothes, and thanked him for his brilliant work. I walked out of his office, stepped into the glass elevator, and pulled out my phone as I descended 40 floors above the city. The anger was completely gone, replaced by a ruthless mechanical focus. I had the ammunition. I had the truth. Now I just needed to set the stage. I stepped out of the high-rise building and into the heavy, humid Atlanta afternoon. The contrast between the freezing, calculated atmosphere of Attorney Sterling's boardroom and the vibrant, beating heart of the city streets grounded me instantly. I walked to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and shut the door, sealing myself in total silence. I did not turn the key in the ignition. I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, letting the sheer magnitude of the impending execution wash over me. It was time to cast the line. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my text messages. I scrolled past the daily check-ins from Malik and the supplier confirmations until I found the thread with my father. The very last message in our history was sitting right there, frozen in digital amber from 5 years ago. It was a cold, brutal text telling me my boxes were on the porch and that I was officially a disgrace. I stared at those old words for a long moment, feeling absolutely nothing but a clinical detachment. I positioned my thumbs over the keyboard. To trap a narcissist, you have to feed their ego until they are too bloated to see the cage closing around them. I had to perfectly emulate the exact version of myself they desperately wanted to believe still existed. I needed to sound small, overwhelmed, and completely out of my depth. I started typing. I told Reginald that he was right. I typed the words slowly, ensuring the tone was sufficiently pathetic. I told him that running this restaurant was suffocating me, that the accounting was a complete disaster, and that I was drowning in the pressure of keeping the doors open. Then I played my first major card. I told him that the city health inspector had shown up unannounced that very morning. I lied and said the surprise inspection absolutely terrified me, that I barely passed, and that the sheer panic of almost being shut down made me realize I could not do this alone anymore. I paused, letting the fake desperation settle into the text, and then I delivered the exact concession he was waiting for. I typed that I was ready to surrender. I told him I was ready to sign over the 20% equity to Connor. I said I realized I desperately needed a real corporate mind to handle the back office, so I could just stay hidden in the kitchen where I belonged. But simply signing a contract was not enough. I needed them inside my territory, surrounded by the exact demographic they had destroyed their finances to impress. I needed maximum exposure, so I typed the hook. I told Reginald I wanted to make the signing official and celebrate our new family business partnership this coming Friday night. I explained that Aura was hosting an exclusive closed-door VIP tasting event to roll out our new spring menu. I made sure to emphasize the word exclusive. Then I casually dropped the guest list. I typed out that the mayor's chief of staff had reserved a booth several prominent city council members were attending, and most importantly, Pastor Davis and the senior elders from their elite Buckhead megachurch had booked the center tables. I knew exactly what reading that guest list would do to Valerie and Reginald. To them, it was not just a dinner service, it was a coronation. The opportunity to walk into a room packed with Atlanta's highest society, strut past their gossipy church friends, and publicly take credit for bailing out their struggling daughter was a drug they simply could not resist. Valerie would want to parade Connor around the dining room, showing off her wealthy white son-in-law as the ultimate savior of my little soul food joint. Reginald would want to stand in front of the local politicians and boast about his expanding commercial portfolio. I read over the message one last time. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It offered them total dominance, public validation, and financial salvation, all wrapped in a single invitation. I hit send. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and finally started the car engine. The drive back to Aura took 20 minutes. I left the phone facing up, watching the screen out of the corner of my eye. I knew Reginald would not reply immediately. He would need to show the text to Valerie. They would need to gloat. They would call Connor and Chloe to celebrate my absolute submission. They would spend at least 10 minutes reveling in their perceived victory before gracing me with a response. I was pulling into the private alley behind my restaurant when the screen finally illuminated. A text from Reginald. I parked the car, picked up the phone, and read his reply. It was exactly as arrogant and patronizing as I had anticipated. He did not offer any comfort regarding my fake panic over the health inspector. He simply told me that it takes a big person to admit when they have failed. He said Connor was already drafting the final equity transfer documents, and that they would handle all the complicated legal jargon so my brain would not hurt. Then he confirmed the trap. He said the entire family would arrive at 8 o'clock sharp on Friday night, and he told me to ensure my hostess held the best table in the center of the VIP lounge for them. He ended the message by telling me to make sure my chef coat was clean, because I would be taking a photo with Connor for the business journals. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. The bait was taken, the hook was swallowed completely down to the stomach. I walked through the heavy steel back doors into the bustling heat of my kitchen. Malik was standing at the expo station, reviewing the prep list for the evening. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes scanning my face for a verdict. He knew where I had gone, and he knew exactly what was at stake. I walked right up to him, grabbed a clean apron from the linen rack, and tied it tightly around my waist. I looked at my brilliant, fiercely loyal chef de cuisine and gave him a single sharp nod. I told Malik that the rats were coming to dinner on Friday. Malik's face broke into a slow, dangerous smile. He wiped his hands on a towel and asked me how many courses we were serving the traders. I told him they were not getting a single bite of our food. I explained that Friday night was no longer just a spring menu tasting for the elite. It was a publicly executed eviction. I pulled Sterling's thick, heavy cardstock envelopes from my tote bag and locked them inside the secure drop safe in my office. The cease and desist order for extortion, the commercial eviction notice for Connor's fraudulent consulting firm, the printed cybersecurity reports proving their pathetic fake review sabotage. For the rest of the week, I operated with a terrifying level of clarity. The anxiety that normally accompanied a major VIP event was completely non-existent. I was no longer a stressed restaurant owner trying to impress food critics. I was a sniper patiently waiting for the wind to die down. We meticulously prepped the kitchen. We polished every single wine glass until it gleamed like a diamond. We confirmed the reservations for the church elders, the local politicians, and the high society influencers. I personally walked through the dining room with my floor manager selecting the absolute perfect table for my family. I did not put them in a quiet, secluded corner. I placed them dead center in the VIP lounge. I wanted them surrounded on all sides by the very people they had bankrupted themselves to impress. I wanted maximum visibility. I wanted every single eye in the building locked onto their table when the hammer finally dropped. Every time I tasted a sauce, every time I inspected a cut of meat, I thought about the sheer poetry of what was about to happen. They spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They tried to bury me in the dark so Chloe could shine. And now, they were willingly walking into a spotlight I had constructed entirely by myself. They were walking into a fortress where I controlled the doors, I controlled the staff, and I owned the very ground beneath their designer shoes. Thursday night, after the final dinner service wrapped, I stood alone in the center of my dining room. The amber chandeliers cast a warm golden glow across the empty velvet booths. The silence was heavy and expectant. I looked at the reserved table in the middle of the room. The trap was flawlessly set. The explosive charges were wired. All I had to do now was wait for the clock to strike 8 on Friday night and hand them the match. Friday night hit Atlanta with a humid electric energy that you could feel in the marrow of your bones. Inside Aura, the atmosphere was nothing short of cinematic. We unlocked the heavy glass doors at exactly 5 o'clock, and within 20 minutes, the dining room transformed into a beautifully orchestrated symphony of high society excellence. The warm amber lighting bounced off the crystal stemware and the polished mahogany tables. A low, thumping bass line of neo-soul layered perfectly beneath the sophisticated hum of power brokers closing deals and politicians securing alliances over plates of blackened catfish and truffle yam puree. Malik was conducting the kitchen like an absolute maestro, calling out tickets with military precision. I stood at the expo window, wiping down the stainless steel pass, watching my empire operate at peak performance. The guest list tonight was a staggering lineup of Atlanta's elite. Seated in the plush emerald booths near the front were 2 prominent city council members deep in conversation. Toward the back, holding court over a spread of my signature smoked short ribs, was the mayor's chief of staff. But the true masterpiece of my seating chart was the center section of the VIP lounge. I had strategically grouped 4 large tables together right in the heart of the room. Seated there were Pastor Davis, his wife, and a dozen senior elders from my parents' elite megachurch in Buckhead. These were the exact people Valerie and Reginald spent their entire lives performing for. The women were draped in custom silk and heavy jewelry, fanning themselves and sipping craft cocktails. The men wore tailored suits, laughing loudly and shaking hands. They were the ultimate audience. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy front doors swung open. I did not have to look at the clock to know it was them. The sudden sharp shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room told me everything I needed to know. I stepped back into the shadows of the kitchen pass and watched them enter. Reginald walked in first, wearing a custom navy blue suit with a pristine silk pocket square. His chest was puffed out so far he looked like he might tip backward. Valerie was right beside him, draped in a highly conspicuous designer trench coat, despite the warm evening, scanning the room to make sure people were watching her arrive. Chloe strutted in behind them, wearing a skin-tight dress that screamed new money, clinging tightly to Connor's arm. Connor wore a ridiculous linen blazer draped over his shoulders, looking completely out of place, but oozing an unearned, aggressive confidence. They did not wait for the hostess. They completely ignored the line of eager patrons waiting for cancellations at the bar. Reginald marched right past the podium, unhooked the velvet rope separating the VIP lounge, and led his parade directly to the center table I had reserved for them. It was a massive round table positioned literally feet away from Pastor Davis and the church elders. The sheer volume of their arrival was intentionally obnoxious. Valerie immediately began waving frantically to the church crowd, projecting her voice over the music to make sure everyone knew she had arrived. She leaned over to embrace the pastor's wife, loud and performative acting, as if she owned the entire building. I watched as my lead server, a brilliant young man named Trey, approached their table with leather-bound menus and a tray of complimentary sparkling water. Connor did not even look at Trey. He literally snapped his fingers in Trey's face, pointed at the water, and demanded a specific, highly expensive brand of imported whiskey. He snapped his fingers a second time to emphasize that he wanted it quickly. My blood boiled instantly. I have a strict zero-tolerance policy for guests disrespecting my staff. I caught Trey's eye across the dining room and gave him a subtle, calming nod. I signaled for him to let it slide, just this once. I needed the rope to have a little more slack before I pulled it tight. Once they were seated, the real show began. Reginald did not waste a single minute. He leaned back in his velvet chair, grabbed his glass of water, and turned his body completely outward to address the neighboring table of church elders. He pitched his voice to carry across the dining room, ensuring I could hear every single word echoing through the acoustic design of my restaurant. He started loudly boasting to the deacons about how they were here on an emergency rescue mission. He laughed a deep, booming, condescending sound and told the table that my little soul food joint had bitten off more than it could chew. He claimed I was drowning in bad debt and operational chaos. He painted a picture of me as a desperate, helpless woman begging her father to save her from financial ruin. Valerie chimed in, placing a heavily ringed hand on her chest. She told the pastor's wife that it simply broke her heart to see me failing so publicly, but thank God the family was stepping in to clean up my massive mess. She gestured grandly toward Connor. Connor sat up straight, adjusting his cuffs, and eagerly took over the narrative. He told the black elders of this powerful megachurch that he was officially taking over the equity of the business tonight. He bragged about his consulting firm, loudly dropping empty corporate buzzwords. He claimed he was going to streamline the overhead, cut the fat, and bring some actual professional business acumen to my struggling kitchen. He stated that while my cooking was cute, I clearly lacked the intellectual capacity to run a multi-million-dollar business without a man like him holding the reins. The church elders listened with a mixture of polite interest and thinly veiled judgment. I could see the whispers starting. Phones were coming out under the table. Text messages were flying across the Buckhead social circles faster than the speed of sound. Valerie was beaming, absolutely intoxicated by the attention. She was playing the benevolent, wealthy savior mother to absolute perfection. Reginald was nodding sagely, soaking in the perceived admiration of his peers. They were completely high on their own fabricated supply. They were sitting in my house, drinking my water, breathing my air, and enthusiastically destroying my character to protect their fragile, bankrupt egos. Malik walked up beside me at the pass. He had heard the entire exchange. He was gripping a stainless steel pair of plating tongs so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He looked at me, a silent, furious question in his eyes, asking if it was time to end the circus. I looked back out at my dining room. I watched Connor snap his fingers at Trey one more time, demanding to know what was taking his whiskey so long. I watched Chloe roll her eyes at the ambiance I had built with my own two hands. I watched my parents sell my dignity for cheap social currency. I reached out and gently took the tongs from Malik's hands, setting them on the counter. I untied my stained prep apron and tossed it into the linen bin. I smoothed the lapels of my custom black chef coat, making sure the gold-embroidered Aura logo on my chest was perfectly crisp. I told Malik to hold the line and freeze all service to the VIP section. It was time for the main course. I grabbed the wireless microphone we used for private event announcements from its charging dock on the wall. The heavy cardstock envelopes containing the cease and desist order and the commercial eviction notice were tucked securely into the deep inside pocket of my chef coat, pressing like a loaded weapon against my ribs. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the furious, resilient energy of my ancestors fill my spine. I pushed open the double doors of the kitchen and stepped out into the blinding, beautiful light of the dining room. I moved through the dining room with a deliberate, unhurried pace. Every step was measured. The soft jazz playing through the overhead speakers felt like a soundtrack specifically composed for this exact moment. Patrons at the perimeter tables paused their conversations to watch me pass. A chef stepping out into the dining room mid-service always commands attention, but I was not just doing a table touch. I was a woman marching toward her absolute liberation. I reached the small raised platform at the edge of the VIP lounge, where we hosted live jazz bands on the weekends. The microphone was resting on its stand. I lifted it off the cradle. I signaled the sound engineer in the back to cut the music. The sudden drop in audio caused a ripple effect. Heads turned, glasses were lowered. The low hum of elite Atlanta society slowly faded into a hush. I tapped the microphone twice. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the pristine acoustic space. I am Kiara, the executive chef and owner of Aura. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for our spring tasting event. Looking around this room, I see familiar faces, local leaders, and the incredible community that has made this restaurant the most coveted reservation in the city. Pastor Davis smiled and nodded from his seat. The church elders clapped politely. Reginald puffed his chest out even further, looking around as if my success was his own personal achievement. Valerie adjusted her designer coat, ready to stand up and take a bow. I let the applause die down completely until the room was pin-drop silent again. We celebrate history in this building. I continued staring dead center at my parents' table. We celebrate resilience. But tonight, I want to take a moment to celebrate something far more personal. I want to extend a very specific welcome to 4 guests sitting right here in the center of the VIP lounge. My father, Reginald, my mother, Valerie, my sister, Chloe, and her husband, Connor. Reginald smiled broadly, raising his water glass to the surrounding tables to soak in the adoration. I want to thank them for coming, I said, dropping the warmth from my voice completely. It is a truly remarkable occasion, especially since this is the very first time they have spoken to me in exactly 5 years. The last time we spoke, they threw me out of their house into the freezing cold because I wanted to be a chef instead of a corporate lawyer. They cut me off financially, emotionally, and socially. They spent half a decade telling everyone in their church congregation and their country club that I had moved overseas. The silence that fell over the dining room was absolute suffocating and terrifyingly heavy. You could hear a pin drop. Pastor Davis lowered his fork slowly to his plate. The church elders who had just been listening to Reginald boast were now staring at him in sheer, unadulterated horror. Valerie's face drained of all color, her jaw dropping open in pure shock. Connor's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. Chloe shrank back into the emerald velvet booth. I stepped down from the platform, still holding the microphone. I walked directly toward their table. Every single eye in the room was locked onto me. Reginald tried to recover. He stood up, forcing a stiff, terrified laugh, trying to play it off to the surrounding VIPs. My daughter has always had a dramatic flair, he choked out, his voice trembling. She is just making a joke. We are here to sign a business deal. We are not making a deal, Reginald, I said into the microphone, stripping him of his title as my father. I stopped right at the edge of his table. The air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. He reached his hand out, expecting me to hand over the 20% equity transfer he had demanded. He expected me to cave under the pressure of the audience. He thought the public scrutiny would force me to play the compliant daughter. I reached inside the deep breast pocket of my custom chef coat. I pulled out the heavy, pristine white envelope bearing Attorney Sterling's embossed gold seal. I did not hand it to him gently. I slapped it down onto the polished mahogany table right over his pristine silverware. You came into my restaurant on Friday night and demanded 20% of my multi-million-dollar company, I said, my voice projecting clearly to every single corner of the room. You threatened to call my landlord to have my lease revoked if I did not sign my life's work over to a white man who has never cooked a meal in his life. You sat here tonight bragging to your church elders that you were stepping in to save me from bankruptcy. Open it, I commanded. Reginald stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. His hands were shaking visibly. He looked around the room, desperate for an ally. But the elite crowd he had spent his life worshipping was looking at him with absolute disgust. He reached down with trembling fingers and broke the gold seal. He pulled out the thick, watermarked legal document. He scanned the first few lines, and the remaining color in his face completely evaporated. He looked like he was going to vomit right onto the white tablecloth. That is not an equity transfer, I announced to the dead silent room. That is a formal cease and desist order for criminal extortion drafted by my legal counsel. It details your exact threats. It details your attempt to blackmail me out of my assets to save yourselves from your own massive drowning debt. Reginald opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The document in his hands laid out every single one of his crimes with surgical, ruthless precision. Attorney Sterling did not hold back. The paperwork explicitly cited the Georgia criminal statutes for extortion and blackmail. It outlined the exact timeline of his threats regarding the commercial lease. It promised immediate and catastrophic legal action if he or anyone at his table attempted to contact me, harass my staff, or interfere with my business operations ever again. You really thought you could march into my sanctuary and threaten me with eviction, I said, taking a step closer so he had to look up at me. You thought you could intimidate me because you thought I was still that vulnerable 30-year-old girl begging for a $15,000 loan. You thought you held all the power. But you did not do your due diligence. You made a fatal miscalculation. I looked at Valerie, who was frantically fanning herself with a menu, desperately trying to hide her face from the staring church elders. I looked at Chloe, who was practically hyperventilating. And then I looked back at Reginald, ensuring the microphone caught every single syllable. You threatened to call my landlord to destroy me, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet intensity that echoed through the speakers. You wanted to rip the floor out from under my feet. But you cannot call my landlord Reginald, and you cannot take my business. You cannot take my business because you are completely broke and you have absolutely no leverage in this city anymore. The gasps from the surrounding tables were audible. In a culture obsessed with image and wealth, exposing a man's secret bankruptcy in front of his peers was the ultimate execution. Reginald sank back into his velvet chair, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen him. The facade of the powerful, untouchable patriarch had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I had stripped him naked in front of the only people whose opinions he actually cared about. I kept the microphone gripped tightly in my hand. The cease and desist was just the appetizer. The main course was sitting right next to him, wearing a ridiculous linen blazer and sweating profusely. It was time to deal with Connor. I turned my absolute focus to the man sweating right through his ridiculous linen blazer. Connor sat frozen in his chair, staring at the catastrophic legal document resting in front of my father. The great white hope of my parents' social climbing dreams was suddenly looking very pale. He shifted uncomfortably, gripping the edge of the table as if trying to anchor himself to a reality that was rapidly slipping away. I reached inside my chef coat one more time. I pulled out a second envelope just as thick and just as official as the first. I did not hand it to him gently. I dropped it squarely onto his pristine white dinner plate right on top of his napkin. I told him to open it. Connor fumbled with the seal, his arrogance completely evaporating under the intense scrutiny of the entire VIP lounge. I did not even wait for him to unfold the document. I lifted the microphone and spoke directly to him, letting my voice carry across the silent dining room. I announced that he was exactly 90 days delinquent on his commercial rent for Suite 200. I told him the document in his hands was an official, legally binding eviction notice. The room murmured with a collective intake of breath. Connor tried to force a laugh, a nervous, high-pitched sound that died almost immediately. He started stammering, telling the surrounding tables that I had lost my mind and asking what on earth I was talking about. He tried to project the image of a confused tech executive dealing with an irrational woman. I stepped closer, leaning down so I was at eye level with him. I spoke into the microphone with slow, deliberate precision. You leased your office space from Phoenix Holdings, I said. Did you really think Reginald's golfing buddies still owned this building? I bought this entire commercial block 2 years ago. I am Phoenix Holdings. I am your landlord. And you have exactly 48 hours to pack up your fake consulting firm and vacate my property before I have the sheriff remove your belongings and change the locks. Connor turned a vibrant shade of crimson. The veins in his neck strained against his collar. He started aggressively sputtering about legal action, claiming he had tenant rights and threatening to sue me for defamation. He was thrashing like a fish caught in a net, trying to use big corporate words to intimidate me. I cut him off immediately. I pulled the final stack of papers from my coat pocket. While we are on the subject of your fraudulent business practices, I announced to the room, let us talk about what you actually do when you are supposedly working in my building. I held up the printed cybersecurity reports for everyone to see. I explained that this past weekend, my restaurant was targeted by a coordinated flood of fake one-star online reviews claiming we had rat infestations and served raw food. I added that on Tuesday morning, a city health inspector showed up for an emergency raid based on an anonymous tip. I made sure to emphasize that we passed that inspection with a perfect 100 score. But the inspector left me a very interesting piece of information, I said, keeping my eyes locked dead on Connor. The anonymous caller used his real name. I paused, letting the weight of his sheer stupidity sink into the audience. Mr. Connor, I said, saying his name with maximum disdain. If you are going to try and destroy a black woman's business, Do not do it using the IP address from the office you are renting from her. You used my own wireless network to post those fake reviews. You called the health department from my building while owing me 3 months of back rent. The reaction from the crowd was devastating. People actually laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was the sharp, mocking laughter of Atlanta high society, recognizing a complete fraud. Connor completely shattered. The sophisticated tech executive act evaporated in a split second. His face contorted with absolute unhinged rage. He stood up violently, knocking his heavy velvet chair backward onto the floor. He pointed his finger directly at my face, shaking with a fury he could no longer contain. He yelled that I had set him up. He screamed that I was trying to humiliate him, and then the mask slipped entirely. "You think you can do this to me?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the restaurant. "You are nothing. You people get a little bit of money and suddenly you forget your place in society. You are just the help. You should be in the back, serving me." The silence that followed was deafening. The entire VIP lounge filled with the most prominent Black leaders, politicians, and the exact church congregation my parents worshipped collectively recoiled. Pastor Davis stood up from his table, his face a mask of pure, undisguised disgust. The mayor's chief of staff shook his head in absolute disbelief. In 10 seconds of unhinged entitlement, Connor had completely obliterated whatever shred of social standing he thought he had. He had exposed the exact racial hostility and classist superiority my parents had banked their entire lives on accommodating. He showed them exactly who he was, and he did it at the top of his lungs in front of the most influential Black elite in the city. Chloe snapped. She looked around the room and realized her entire social life, her status, her country club invitations were burning to ash in real time. She jumped up from the booth and started screaming at Connor. She slapped his arm, demanding to know if we were actually broke. She asked him where the trust fund money went. When Connor ignored her and continued glaring at me, Chloe threw a massive hysterical tantrum right there in the middle of the dining room. She stomped her feet in her designer heels, wailing that her life was ruined, crying that her friends were watching, and screaming that this was all my fault. She looked absolutely ridiculous. She was a grown woman throwing a toddler's fit because her credit cards were about to bounce. Then came the final act of the circus. Valerie realized the ship had completely sunk, the walls were caving in, and her perfect image was destroyed. She tried to deploy her ultimate weapon, the performative victim tears. She buried her face in her hands, forcing loud, dramatic sobs that echoed over Chloe's tantrum. She reached out across the table toward me, her hands shaking, her voice trembling with fake devastation. "Kiara, please!" she cried out, putting on a theatrical display for the church elders, who were now watching her with severe judgment. "We were just trying to protect you. We saw you struggling with this business, and we wanted what was best for you. We love you. We are your family. Please do not do this to us." I did not blink. I did not soften. I stepped right up to her, close enough that she had to look up into my eyes. I spoke into the microphone, my voice a deadly quiet blade that cut right through her pathetic sobbing. "Protect me," I asked. I let the question hang in the air for a long, heavy second before delivering the absolute kill shot. "You did not want to protect me, Valerie." I looked at her with pure ice in my veins. "You told me I was a jealous embarrassment to this family. You told me I was a bitter, small-minded woman who could not handle the fact that my younger sister had secured a beautiful, successful life while I was still scrubbing grease off frying pans. You told me I was poisoning your home with my jealousy and my aggressive ghetto attitude. You looked me dead in the eyes and said I was a failure because I chose to be a failure." Valerie gasped sharply. Her fake tears dried up instantly. Her jaw clamped shut. I had just quoted her exact vicious words from 5 years ago, broadcasting them directly to her entire church congregation and every single socialite in the room. There was nowhere left to hide. The illusion of the loving Christian mother was completely annihilated. The masks were gone. The truth was laid bare under the amber chandeliers of the empire I built entirely without them. I stood tall in my chef coat, looking down at the ruins of the family that threw me away, knowing I had finally won. I did not need to say another word. I gave a single sharp nod to the back of the dining room where my security team was standing by. My head of security stepped forward, immediately flanked by three massive men in dark suits. They moved with absolute ruthless efficiency. They reached the table and grabbed Connor first. He tried to puff out his chest and fight back, shouting about his rights, but the security guards effortlessly hauled him up by the arms and marched him directly toward the exit. Reginald tried to salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. He stood up stiffly and jerked his jacket straight, acting as if leaving was his own idea. But the damage was permanently done. Valerie hid her face behind her designer handbag, sobbing real tears of profound social humiliation as she practically ran for the door. Chloe stumbled behind them in her expensive heels, her face streaked with ruined makeup, whining uncontrollably. The entire high society crowd watched them get paraded out like common criminals. Cell phones were out and camera flashes lit up the dining room. The elite leaders of Atlanta documented every single second of their spectacular downfall. Pastor Davis literally turned his back as Reginald walked past his table. The mayor's chief of staff shook his head in pure disgust. The heavy glass front doors swung shut behind them. I looked out over my dining room. The silence hung in the air for one long heartbeat before someone at the back of the room started clapping. Within seconds, the entire VIP lounge erupted into a massive round of applause. I gave a slight bow, told my guests that the next round of drinks and all desserts for the evening were entirely on the house, and signaled the sound engineer. The smooth jazz music swelled back up, filling the space with warm, vibrant energy. The tension evaporated, replaced by the joyful hum of a community that recognized and respected the truth. I fast-forward 6 months. The destruction of their fake empire was absolute and merciless. Reginald and Valerie lost the sprawling Alpharetta estate to foreclosure. Without the ability to extort my business equity, they could not make a single payment on their underwater mortgages. The bank seized the property and auctioned it off. They had to pack their belongings and move into a tiny, outdated rental property on the far outskirts of the city. The social isolation was even worse than the financial ruin. The church community completely excommunicated them. Pastor Davis asked Reginald to step down from the deacon board, citing a lack of moral integrity. The country club revoked their membership due to months of unpaid dues. The people they had spent their entire lives trying to impress would not even return their phone calls. They became social pariahs, completely isolated in the prison of their own making. Connor faced a much harsher reality. His fraudulent business practices and unpaid commercial debts caught the attention of state investigators. Without Reginald's money to hide behind, his hollow shell company collapsed entirely. The moment the luxury car was repossessed and the bank accounts froze, Chloe packed her bags. The golden child abandoned him instantly when the money ran out. She moved into a cramped, cheap apartment on the opposite side of town. I heard through the grapevine that she is currently working a minimum-wage retail job at a local mall, desperately trying to hide behind sunglasses so her former wealthy friends do not recognize her folding shirts. I do not look back. I do not check on them. I do not feel a single ounce of guilt for letting the consequences of their own actions catch up to them. I am standing right where I belong. I am in the bustling, joyful kitchen of Aura. The fires are burning hot and the air smells like roasted garlic, smoked hickory, and absolute freedom. My journey taught me the real definition of Black excellence. It is not about proximity to whiteness. It is not about designer clothes, country club memberships, or performing for people who demand you shrink yourself to fit their toxic narrative. True Black excellence is about authenticity. It is about the resilience to build something magnificent from the ground up with your own 2 hands. It is about honoring your roots, lifting up your community, and protecting your peace at all costs. I look across my kitchen. Malik is laughing with the sous chefs, expertly plating a flawless dish. Attorney Sterling is sitting at his usual reserved table in the corner, enjoying a perfectly seared snapper and raising a glass of bourbon in my direction. They are my family. They earned that title through unwavering loyalty, profound respect, and mutual support. The blood in my veins does not obligate me to endure abuse. I built a multi-million-dollar empire, I bought my own building, and I legally evicted the toxicity from my life permanently. Sometimes the trash takes itself out. Have you ever had to legally evict a toxic family member from your life? Tell me in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about claiming your power and protecting your peace. I stand in the center of my kitchen and just breathe. The dinner rush has finally slowed to a steady, manageable rhythm, but the energy in the room is absolutely electric. The heavy air smells like smoked hickory charred thyme and the rich caramelized depth of a perfect demi-glace. It smells like absolute, undeniable freedom. I watch my line cooks moving with that beautiful synchronized precision, calling out tickets and sliding pristine white plates across the stainless steel pass. There is no anxiety here. There is no performative stress. There is only the pure, honest work of feeding people's souls. For 30 years of my life, I was told that this room was a demotion. My parents looked at a commercial kitchen and saw servitude. They looked at the culinary traditions of our ancestors and saw something that needed to be hidden away in the dark so they could assimilate into country club society. They spent their entire lives chasing an illusion. They thought black excellence meant proximity to whiteness. They thought it meant marrying a man like Connor who wielded a fake trust fund and an unearned sense of superiority. They thought excellence was defined by the zip code of a heavily mortgaged house and the approval of an elite church congregation that would abandon them the second their bank accounts ran dry. They were so tragically wrong. I look around my restaurant, and I see the actual definition of black excellence. It is not about shrinking yourself to fit into rooms that were never built for you. It is about buying the entire building and constructing your own room from the ground up. It is about financial literacy, operating completely debt-free and owning the literal bricks beneath your feet. It is about taking the ingredients our ancestors survived on, the collard greens, the oxtails, the yams, and elevating them to a level of mastery that forces the entire culinary world to stand up and pay respect. Excellence is authenticity. It is the absolute refusal to compromise your identity for anyone else's comfort. We are taught from a very young age that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned to endure endless amounts of disrespect, manipulation, and abuse simply because the people inflicting it share our DNA. Society tells us to forgive and forget, to keep the peace, to protect the family image at all costs. But I learned the hard way that protecting a toxic family image will eventually bankrupt your spirit and your bank account. I chose to protect my peace instead. I chose to sever the diseased branches so the rest of the tree could actually thrive. The heavy swinging doors to the kitchen push open, and Attorney Sterling walks in. He has completely dropped his terrifying courtroom demeanor. He has his suit jacket slung over his shoulder and his tie loosened, revealing the tired but deeply satisfied smile of a man who just executed a flawless legal victory. Malik wipes down his prep station, tosses his towel into the linen bin, and walks over to join us. I reach under the chef's counter and pull out a bottle of top-shelf bourbon I have been saving for a very specific occasion. I grab 3 heavy crystal tumblers and pour a generous measure into each one. I hand a glass to Sterling, the brilliant, ruthless legal mind who helped me secure my empire and blindside the people trying to steal it. I hand the second glass to Malik, my fiercely loyal chef de cuisine, the man who stood by my side in freezing parking lots, flipping burgers and washing dishes, when I had absolutely nothing to my name but a canvas cot and a fireproof lockbox. I look at the 2 men standing with me in the heart of my kitchen. They do not share my bloodline, but they have earned the title of family 10 times over. Family is not a birthright. It is an ongoing, active choice. It is the people who stand in front of you when the bullets start flying and stand behind you when you need someone to guard your back. I raise my crystal tumbler, and the 3 of us clink our glasses together. The sharp, bright sound cuts through the ambient noise of the kitchen. We toast to owning our own land. We toast to the relentless hustle that got us here. And we toast to the absolute beauty of watching a toxic house of cards collapse under the weight of its own lies. I take a slow, smooth sip of the bourbon, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I have never felt more grounded, more powerful, or more completely at peace. The girl they threw away is gone forever. The woman who replaced her is an unstoppable force of nature, and she is never apologizing for her success again. Sometimes the trash takes itself out. The biggest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood does not automatically make someone family. Real family is built on mutual respect, loyalty, and showing up when things get incredibly hard. For years, I broke myself trying to fit into a toxic definition of excellence that was designed to make me feel small. But true excellence is found in authenticity and the resilience to build your own table when others refuse you a seat. Never sacrifice your peace or your purpose to earn conditional love from people committed to misunderstanding you. Your worth is defined solely by your own unbreakable spirit. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to finally protect your peace and build your own success, share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more journeys of claiming your power.